She treated a customer with kindness and got fired for it, but the next day she walked back in as the boss. The sun had barely risen over Ridgeway, Colorado, casting a soft golden hue across the quiet streets. The morning air was crisp, carrying the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon from Westwood Cafe, a small diner nestled between a gas station and a bookstore. For Daisy, this place had been her second home for nearly 3 years. It wasn't perfect, the pay was low, the shifts were long, and the management barely cared, but it paid the bills. She had learned to navigate the daily chaos, juggling orders and impatient customers, always keeping her head down and doing her job. But Westwood Cafe had an unspoken rule: service wasn't the same for everyone. Customers were treated differently depending on how they looked. A businessman in a tailored suit would be welcomed with smiles and quick service, while a construction worker in dusty boots would be met with indifference. Daisy had seen it countless times. Dion and Bonnie, two of the senior servers, controlled the tone of the cafe. They knew exactly who to charm for tips and who to ignore. Daisy had tried speaking up before, but she had learned the hard way that no one liked a troublemaker, so she adapted. She did her work, avoided conflicts, and tried to convince herself that staying quiet was easier. After all, she needed this job. But as Daisy tied her apron and stepped behind the counter that morning, she had no idea that today would be different. Today, she would make a choice that would cost her everything and change her life forever. The quiet rhythm of the morning rush had begun to settle when the door of Westwood Cafe swung open, the bell above it chiming softly. Daisy didn't look up at first. She was at the counter, refilling the sugar dispensers, listening to the familiar hum of conversation, the clatter of silverware against plates. Then she felt it a shift in the air. When she glanced toward the entrance, she saw him. An older man, probably in his late 60s, stepped inside. He was dressed in simple, clean, but well-worn clothes, a button-up shirt and slacks that had seen years of use. His posture was straight, his expression calm, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. Daisy had seen that look before, the quiet expectation of being ignored. She turned to her coworkers. Dion, who had been joking with a busboy, gave the man a brief glance before turning away. Bonnie, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, didn't even pretend to acknowledge him. The silence was loud. Daisy knew what this was. She had seen it play out 100 times before. Some customers were welcomed with smiles and quick service. Others, like this man, were treated as if they didn't exist. For a moment, Daisy hesitated. She could look away, just like the others. That would be easier. But then she met the man's eyes. He was still waiting, giving them a chance to prove him wrong. Daisy made her choice. She grabbed a menu, walked over, and smiled. "Good morning, sir. Just you today." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he hadn't expected her kindness. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but quiet. Daisy nodded and gestured to a booth near the window. "Would you like to sit here?" "That's fine," he replied, following her lead. As he settled into the seat, she handed him the menu. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Coffee," he said. "Black." "Coming right up." Daisy turned toward the coffee station, but she could feel the eyes on her. Dion and Bonnie were watching. Bonnie muttered something under her breath, shaking her head. Dion smirked. Neither of them bothered to hide their annoyance. Daisy ignored them. She grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and poured a steaming cup, setting it down in front of the man. He looked up at her, studying her expression. "You the only one working today?" he asked, voice low. Daisy knew exactly what he meant. She glanced at her coworkers. Dion was still joking with the busboy. Bonnie was scrolling through her phone. She forced a small smile. "Feels like it sometimes." That made him chuckle. Flipping open the menu, he scanned the options. "What's good here?" Daisy pretended to think. "Depends on what you're in the mood for. The steak and eggs are always solid, but if you want my personal favorite, the blueberry pancakes are the way to go." He raised an eyebrow. "That good, huh?" "Promise you won't regret it." A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Blueberry pancakes, then." Daisy jotted it down. Great choice. But as she walked back to the kitchen, she felt it, the shift in the air. It was subtle but unmistakable. The way Bonnie's eyes narrowed. The way Dion kept glancing toward the booth, like they were waiting for her to slip up. Even Tom, the manager, peeked out from his office, scanning the room before disappearing again. A bad feeling settled in Daisy's stomach. She had just put a target on her back. Daisy barely slept that night. Something about the way Bonnie had muttered under her breath, the way Dion had smirked, and the way Tom had peeked out of his office left a bad feeling gnawing at her stomach. She told herself she was overthinking. She had done nothing wrong. If anything, she had done exactly what a server was supposed to do, serve customers. So why did it feel like she had just made the worst mistake of her career? The next morning, Daisy pulled into Westwood Cafe's parking lot under a sky painted with streaks of soft orange. The crisp air carried the scent of fresh coffee brewing inside. It was supposed to be a normal morning, but something was off. She could feel it the moment she stepped inside. The usual sounds of quiet conversation and the clatter of plates were there, but the atmosphere was different, heavier. Dion and Bonnie were already there, standing near the counter, whispering. They both turned to look at her the moment she walked in. Bonnie's lips curled into a knowing smirk. Dion crossed his arms, amusement flickering in his eyes. Daisy's grip tightened on her apron. Then she heard the faint creak of a door opening behind her. Tom. He stood in the doorway of his office, arms folded, expression unreadable. Daisy, he said, his voice flat. Come with me. A cold pit settled in her stomach. She followed him inside, the door clicking shut behind her. The office was small, cluttered, the desk covered in paperwork and a half-empty coffee cup. But Daisy's eyes went straight to the folder in front of him. Her file. Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. We're letting you go. The words hit like a slap. For a second, Daisy thought she misheard him. What? Tom didn't blink. It's not working out. Her heart pounded. Not working out? She had been here for 3 years. She had never missed a shift. Never been late. She worked double shifts, covered for people who called out, and treated every customer with respect. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You're kidding, right? Tom exhaled through his nose, already tired of the conversation. It's a decision we've made. We. That was all Daisy needed to hear. Her gaze flicked back toward the door. Dion and Bonnie. She could picture them now, standing just outside, waiting for the inevitable. Her hands curled into fists. This was because of yesterday. She stared at Tom, searching for even the smallest sign of guilt, of hesitation, of anything that suggested he knew this was wrong. But there was nothing. Her throat tightened. So I get fired for doing my job? Tom's fingers tapped against the desk, his face expressionless. You can collect your final paycheck next week. That was it. No warning, no explanation. Just out. Daisy's jaw clenched. There was no point in arguing. Slowly, she reached behind her, untying her apron. She set it down neatly on the chair. And then, before she left, she made herself look at Tom one last time. You know this isn't right. Tom didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Daisy shook her head, turned on her heel, and walked out. Bonnie was still leaning against the counter when she stepped back into the dining area, that same smug smirk plastered across her face. Dion was pretending to wipe down a table, but he wasn't even trying to hide his satisfaction. They had been waiting for this. Daisy felt her face burn not with embarrassment, but with anger. She wanted to say something, to call them out, to demand to know how they could be so damn heartless. But she didn't. She lifted her chin, walked past them without a word, and pushed through the doors into the cold morning air. For the first time in 3 years, she had no job, no paycheck, no backup plan. She got into her car, slammed the door shut, and gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. How was she going to pay rent? How was she going to help her brother with groceries? How was she? Her phone buzzed. Daisy ignored it at first, staring blankly at the windshield, her thoughts spiraling. Then she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated. Then with a shaking hand she answered. Hello? A deep voice came through the line, steady, familiar. Daisy, this is Blaine. She frowned. I'm sorry. Who? A pause. The man you served yesterday at Westwood Cafe. Her breath caught. She sat up straighter. Oh, yes, sir. How can I help you? There was a pause. Then Blaine said something that made her freeze. I heard what happened. Daisy's stomach twisted. Of course he had. News traveled fast in places like Westwood Cafe. She forced out a bitter laugh. Yeah, well, she muttered. Guess I should have just ignored you like everyone else. Blaine's next words sent a shockwave through her chest. That's exactly why I'm calling. Because this wasn't the end of Daisy's story. It was just the beginning. Daisy's fingers tightened around the phone. She barely knew this man Blaine. Just another customer. Or so she had thought. And yet here he was, calling her the morning after she had been fired. Her pulse quickened. Why was he reaching out? I don't understand, she said carefully. Why are you calling me? Blaine's voice was steady. Because I was there, Daisy. I saw what happened. Daisy swallowed hard, her mind racing. Had he complained? Maybe he had called the cafe, confronted Tom, demanded an explanation. Maybe, just maybe, this was all some huge mistake, and Tom was about to call her and apologize, saying she could come back. But Blaine's next words shattered that illusion. I wasn't just there for breakfast, he said. I was there to see how my employees treat people. Her breath caught. Employees? Her stomach flipped as realization sank in. You? You own Westwood Cafe? Yes, Blaine confirmed, his tone calm. I own several businesses, and I make it a habit to visit them unannounced. No formal inspections, no warnings. That's the only way to see how a place is really run. Daisy pressed her fingers to her temple. This couldn't be real. And what did you learn? She asked, exhaustion creeping into her voice. Blaine sighed. That I have a serious problem with my staff. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Yeah, no kidding. Silence stretched between them for a moment. Then Blaine said something that made her freeze. I let them fire you on purpose. Daisy's entire body went rigid. You what? I needed to see what they would do, Blaine explained, his voice firm but not unkind. I wanted to know if this was just about poor service or if it was something deeper. Now I have my answer. Daisy's head spun. He let them fire her? Just to prove a point? So you sat there, she said slowly, anger bubbling beneath her words, and watched them throw me out? Like some kind of test? I know it wasn't fair, Blaine admitted, his voice quieter now. But now I know exactly who I can't trust to run my business the way it should be run. Daisy closed her eyes, frustration rising in her chest. She had lost her job, her security, her paycheck. And for what? She exhaled sharply. What does that mean for me then? There was a shift in Blaine's tone, something firm, decisive. It means I need someone I can trust, he said. Someone who actually understands what it means to run a restaurant fairly. Someone who won't pick and choose who deserves dignity based on their own prejudices. Daisy frowned, shaking her head. I still don't see what this has to do with me. Blaine's next words stopped her cold. I want you to come back, he said, as the new manager. Daisy's breath caught. For a moment she thought she had misheard him. What? You heard me. Blaine's voice was steady. Tom is gone. I fired him this morning. Her mouth fell open. Bonnie and Dion were going to lose their minds. I know this is sudden, Blaine continued, but I'm not interested in anyone else taking over. You understand what matters in a workplace. You know how people should be treated. That's exactly what Westwood Cafe needs. Daisy's hands trembled slightly. She had never imagined herself in a leadership role. She had just been trying to do her job. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. Yes, you can, Blaine said without hesitation. And you should. She stared out the windshield, her mind spinning. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been tossed aside like she didn't matter. And now she was being offered the very position of the man who had fired her. She took a slow, steadying breath. What do you say? Blaine asked. Daisy hesitated. She could still hear Bonnie's mocking voice, Dion's smug silence, Tom's dismissive tone. They had counted her out, thought they had gotten rid of her for good. But now she had a chance to be the change they never saw coming. Daisy lifted her chin, gripping the phone a little tighter. I'll do it, she said. Blaine exhaled, satisfied. Good. Come in tomorrow morning. You start at 8. Daisy nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'll be there. As she hung up, she sat in stunned silence for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as the reality of it all sank in. Less than a day ago, she had walked out of Westwood Cafe with nothing. Tomorrow, she would be walking back in as the boss. The morning air was crisp as Daisy stood outside Westwood Cafe, gripping the strap of her bag. The sky was still a shade of soft gray, the town just beginning to stir awake. Less than 24 hours ago, she had walked out of this place feeling defeated, humiliated, discarded. Today, she was walking back in with something Bonnie, Dion, and even Tom had never imagined she would have: power. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and pushed open the door. The scent of coffee and warm pastries filled the air. It felt the same, but everything had changed. At first, no one noticed her. Then Bonnie turned from the counter, saw her, and froze. Daisy watched as confusion flickered across Bonnie's face, her smirk faltering just slightly. Dion, who had been laughing with a busboy, caught sight of her too. His mouth snapped shut mid-sentence, his shoulders stiffening as if bracing for impact. Daisy let the moment stretch. Let them feel it. Then she walked toward the counter, placing her bag down with quiet confidence. Bonnie recovered first, scoffing. "What the hell are you doing here?" Daisy tilted her head slightly. "You'll find out soon enough." Bonnie's brows furrowed, but before she could respond, a door opened at the back of the cafe. Tom. He stepped out, already flipping through a stack of papers, irritation creasing his forehead. "Bonnie, I need you to—" Then he saw Daisy. His body went rigid. His eyes flicked from her to Bonnie, then to Dion, like he was trying to piece together what was happening. "Daisy," he said slowly, "you don't work here anymore." She smiled, not out of warmth, but out of certainty. "Actually," she said, "I do." Tom blinked. "What?" A voice cut through the room before she could answer. "I believe I can clarify that." Blaine. Every head in the room turned. He entered the cafe with the kind of quiet confidence that commanded attention. His hands tucked casually in the pockets of his coat, his gaze sweeping across the space before settling on Tom. Bonnie's face paled. Dion looked like he wished he could disappear. Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. Blaine stopped beside Daisy, his expression unreadable. "As of this morning," he said evenly, "Westwood Cafe has undergone some management changes." His voice was calm, controlled but absolute. He turned to Tom, delivering the final blow without hesitation. "Effective immediately, your position is terminated." A gasp rippled through the cafe. Bonnie's jaw dropped. Dion looked like he had been punched in the gut. Tom's face turned a deep shade of red. "Wait a damn minute." "No!" Blaine's voice was sharp. "I've already heard enough from you." Tom's mouth snapped shut. Daisy almost felt bad for him. Almost. Blaine turned his attention to the rest of the staff. "Some of you may be wondering what's going on," he continued. "Let me make it simple." He gestured toward Daisy. "This woman was the only employee who treated me with respect. The only one who did her job the way it should be done." His voice hardened. "The rest of you? Some of you ignored me completely. Some of you made it clear you had no interest in serving certain customers at all." His gaze swept over the stunned faces of the staff. "That ends today." Silence thickened in the room. Then he turned back to Daisy. "Daisy is your new manager." Bonnie staggered back as if she had been slapped. Dion's jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. A busboy standing near the kitchen shifted awkwardly, looking between Daisy and Blaine like he wanted to clap. Daisy finally let herself smile. She turned toward Bonnie and Dion, who were still frozen in shock. "Well," she said lightly, "this is awkward." Bonnie's expression twisted. She turned to Blaine, voice sharp with disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious." Blaine's tone was unwavering. "You don't like it? You're free to leave." Bonnie's mouth snapped shut, her nostrils flaring. She wasn't stupid. She knew walking out meant losing her paycheck, and Bonnie wasn't about to do that. Dion, however, wasn't as smart. "This is bull." Blaine cut him off with a single look. "You're welcome to quit as well." Dion froze. His mouth opened, then closed like he was doing the math in his head. Bonnie was still glaring daggers at Daisy, but Daisy didn't care. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Looks like we all have a lot of adjusting to do," she said, her voice light but firm. "So let's get to work." Bonnie stormed toward the coffee machine, mumbling under her breath. Dion grabbed a rag and started wiping down a table, his movements stiff with anger. Blaine glanced at Daisy, amusement flickering in his eyes. I have a feeling you'll do just fine here. Daisy exhaled, watching as the cafe settled into its new reality, one where she was in charge. And for the first time since she walked into this building 3 years ago, she felt something she had never felt before: respect. Daisy knew change wouldn't happen overnight. As she stepped into the role of manager, she could feel the tension lingering in the air. She had expected resistance, welcomed it even. People like Bonnie and Dion wouldn't adjust easily. Old habits die hard. For the first few days, they made their displeasure painfully obvious. Bonnie barely spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. Gone were her usual smirks and snide remarks, replaced by tight-lipped silence and pointed glares. Dion sulked through every shift, making it clear he was only sticking around because he had no better options. His usual arrogance had dulled, but the resentment in his eyes hadn't. Some of the younger servers, who had once followed Bonnie and Dion's lead, now watched Daisy carefully, unsure of where they stood. And then, there were the ones who didn't stay at all. A couple of employees quit within the first week, walking out without so much as a goodbye. No notice. No explanation. They didn't need to say it, Daisy already knew. The way things used to work, the unspoken rules about who deserved good service and who didn't, were over. She didn't lose sleep over it. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to make things right. Daisy spent her first days as manager observing. She paid attention to who actually put in the effort, who resisted change, and who just needed a push in the right direction. And slowly things began to shift. The kitchen staff, who had long learned to keep their heads down, started speaking up more. They made suggestions, pointed out when things weren't fair. They could feel that something was different. The younger servers, who had once feared Bonnie and Dion's judgment, started mirroring Daisy instead, watching how she treated customers, all customers. One night, a busboy, Noah, a college kid who worked nights to help pay for school, stopped her as she was wiping down the counter. "You really got rid of Tom for that?" he asked, his voice careful. Daisy looked up. "For what?" "For being a jackass to customers." Noah hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I mean, we all knew it happened, but I didn't think anyone actually cared." Daisy set down the rag, meeting his eyes. "I care." Noah nodded slowly. Then, to her surprise, he gave her a small, appreciative smile before heading back to his station. And just like that, things started to change. It wasn't immediate. There were setbacks. There were bad days. Some customers were still wary, testing the waters to see if the cafe had really changed. But over time, they noticed. The customers who had been ignored in the past started coming in more often. They smiled when they saw Daisy behind the counter. Regulars who had never spoken much before started to open up, chatting with the servers, tipping more than they used to. Even the staff, the ones who had been skeptical at first, began following Daisy's lead. And then, one afternoon, Blaine walked in. Daisy was in the middle of balancing invoices when she heard his voice. "How's my investment doing?" She looked up, pushing the paperwork aside. A small smirk played on her lips. "I think we're in good shape." Blaine glanced around. The cafe was busy not just with customers, but with a different kind of energy. There was no tension, no coldness. The staff moved with purpose. The air was lighter. The undercurrent of favoritism and exclusion that had once poisoned this place? Gone. Blaine nodded, satisfied. "Told you you'd be fine." Daisy leaned against the counter. "You didn't exactly give me a choice." Blaine chuckled. "No, I didn't." Daisy exhaled, glancing around. "It's weird," she admitted. "For the longest time, this job was just a job, a paycheck." She shook her head. "And now, it's something more." Blaine's expression softened. "Funny how life works, huh?" Daisy thought back to that morning in her car, sitting there feeling like she had lost everything. And yet, here she was. She wasn't just another waitress anymore. She was the boss. And she had made damn sure that Westwood Cafe would never go back to the way it was. Because doing the right thing wasn't always easy. Sometimes it cost you everything. But sometimes it gave you more than you ever imagined. Life often challenges our integrity, testing whether we stand by our values when it's inconvenient. Daisy's story reminds us that doing the right thing may cost us in the short term a job, security, or comfort, but it often leads to greater opportunities. Setbacks are not failures. They are moments of transformation. When faced with injustice, have the courage to stand firm. Respect, fairness, and kindness may not always be rewarded immediately, but they shape a future worth living. True success isn't just about personal gain. It's about making a difference. Choose integrity because it defines who you truly are.